For our 40th wedding anniversary, our daughters gave us tickets to see Billy Joel in concert at Wrigley Field. It was a beautiful night. We had great seats. He put on a really good show. All in all, it was a wonderful way to spend your anniversary. Now, I have to admit, I'm not the biggest Billy Joel fan. I won't turn him off if he comes on the radio. And I do have his greatest hits record, though I'm not sure our record player works anymore. But I do love one particular song of his, the one that made him famous, called Piano Man. Song about the days of which he tried to scratch out a living and tried to make it in the music business by playing in a tiny bar someplace. And it was particularly stirring to hear it because there were 35,000 voices singing along with him. There are a lot of great lyrics from the song, but the one that's pertinent to us here this morning comes from the chorus, where it says that the patrons sit at the bar and put bread in my jar and say, "Man, what are you doing here? Man, what are you doing here?" That's a question I ask myself a lot, often on Saturday morning evenings before I have to preach. And I remember one evening a long time ago where I woke up in the middle of the night with a really upset stomach. And I got up and found that the palms of my feet and hands were itchy and red. And I watched as a rash kind of spread through my body. I found this to be kind of a distressing set of events. And so I went into the living room where it was cooler. It was a hot summer night, hoping that watching TV would take my mind off the strange things that was happening to my body. The TV guy said that an episode of Mission Impossible was on. I hadn't seen that in years. That sounded good. But for the next 10 minutes, it seemed to be the longest commercial I'd ever seen. It turned out to be my introduction to the Home Shopping Network. I thought, who's watching this nonsense at 3 o'clock in the morning? And then the answer came to me, other people with mysterious rashes. I wasn't sick. I didn't have food poisoning. I wasn't having an allergic reaction. Instead, I was reacting to the stress I was experiencing. The agency I was working for, Presbyterian Children's Village, was in the midst of massive changes as we tried to adjust to the more and more troubled adolescents that we were getting. It had been my job to design those changes, and now it was going to be my job to implement them. We found ourselves at a crossroads in the program, and it was scary to think about where we were heading. I didn't care much for the Home Shopping Network, so I went onto the grounds for a walk. Finally sat on a bench and looked at the stars. And I have to say, as I was sitting there, I asked myself the question, what am I doing here? When I first came out to Northwest Indiana, the vice president of our board was a young Presbyterian pastor named Roger Reber. He was down at Rangeline Presbyterian, which is down near Hebron. And one of our other board members, Bill Kendall, a longtime member of this church, asked Roger, who was from San Francisco, what he was doing at Rangeline. Roger said, "It's because God played a trick on me." And I have to say that night, I was thinking much the same thing. What am I doing here? Sort of felt like maybe God had played a trick on me. What are you doing here is the question that God brings to Elijah. What are you doing here? In our contemplative prayer group this summer, we meditated on that question. And I realized how powerful it is. What are you doing here? I also saw the various ways that you can take that question, a lot of which depends on your tone of voice. For the piano man, what are you doing here was the amazement the patrons were expressing that somebody with his gifts was playing in this isolated bar. It might be an inquiring question. What brought you here? What are you doing here? It might be about surprise. When you're surprised to find somebody you know at a place that you didn't expect. What are you doing here? It might precede an invitation. What are you doing? If you're doing nothing, why don't we do something together? It might be about bafflement. You might be looking at somebody you know, or you might be looking at your kids and say, what are you doing? Or it might be a wake-up call to someone. What are you doing, man? Why are you doing that? It might be a scolding. Young man, just what do you think you're doing? Young man, just what do you think you're doing? That's something I heard once or twice, a long time ago. Now I hear, old man, just what do you think you're doing? It might be self-scolding. What are you doing, Mark? Or it might be a soul-searching question. What are you doing here? To me, that's the question that God brings to Elijah, the soul-searching question. What are you doing here, Elijah? As I thought about it as a soul-searching question, it's one of those questions that seems to bring on even more questions. How did I get here? What brought me here? Am I happy? Have I made good decisions in my life? Why did I think that such and such was a good idea? Is my life meaningful? Do I like who I am? What does God want from me? Is God pleased with me? Who made the rules of this game? Has my life made a difference? And what will be my legacy? Questions that often bring us to a crossroads where we have to make a decision. Are we going to go forward on the same old path, or are we going to change directions? And if we're going to change directions, which new path should we take? When we find ourselves at a crossroad, it often creates something of a crisis. I always found it interesting that in the Chinese language, Chinese words are made up of characters rather than letters. The word crisis in Chinese is made up of two characters. The first means danger, the second means opportunity. For me, it captures the crisis perfectly. The danger is easy to see. There's lots to be scared about, the uncertainty. But lying beside the danger, not so easy to see, is opportunity. And when we come to a crossroads, the question is, which one will we respond to, the danger or the opportunity? At a crossroads time in his life, the poet Robert Frost said that he took the less traveled road, meaning that he chose to take the path that wasn't conventional, that was going to lead who knows where. And Frost tells us that choice to take the less traveled road made all the difference for his life. He chose to face the danger and to seize the opportunity, and it made all the difference for his life. In 1 Kings, the prophet Elijah seems to come out of nowhere. All of a sudden, he appears on the scene, and he begins challenging the king and the queen and taking on the prophets of another god. He's successful in taking on those prophets, but he's also successful in enraging the queen of Israel, Jezebel, who orders a hit on Elijah. She wants him killed. And so Elijah runs for his life, crossing the River Jordan and going into the wilderness And in our passage this morning, we find him exhausted after a day and night's journey and collapsing under the lone tree that he could find in the wilderness. He seems to be overwhelmed by sadness and overcome by fear. He also seems to have spewed some bitterness. He asked God to take his life, and he says that I'm no better than my ancestors. Scholars disagree on what he meant by that. For me, it seemed to be his way of saying that his reward for answering God's call was to have his life endangered and to be fleeing for his life. And he finds himself in the wilderness like his ancestors who wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. But they wandered for 40 years because when they came to a crossroads, when God wanted them to enter the promised land, they chose not to. They responded to the danger. He performed God's will, and this seemed to be his reward. And so he wonders if he should just pack it in. Now, it seems to me that God seemed to cheerfully ignore his plea, providing him instead with food and drink, reminiscent of the food and drink that God provided on the Exodus. And then comes the question, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? Jezebel seems to put Elijah on one crossroads. This soul-searching question seems to have put Elijah on a different crossroads. How's he going to respond? You hear a lot of talk in our culture about midlife crises. The stereotype of midlife crisis used to be a 50-ish man wearing modish clothes, a really terrible toupee, tooling around town in a sports car. And I have to pause here for an aside. Most of the time I don't care about cars. I just want them to drive, and I want seats that I can get out of. But when I was 14, the college kid up the street got this blue Triumph Spitfire. And it's the one car in my life that I really loved. And so I want you to know that in a few years, if you see me tooling around Munster in the closest thing I can find to that blue Triumph Spitfire, I'm not having an old age crisis. Remember that maturity is defined by the ability to delay gratification. And I will have waited 55 years for that car, which means that I'm actually incredibly mature when I drive around town. If you see me in a toupee, though, you need to start worrying. They did research once to find out whether a midlife crisis actually existed. And they got surprising results. What they discovered is it seems that human beings about every 10 years go through transitional periods. Periods of upheaval, periods of change, period of reflection, periods of symptoms. They came to call them the age 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 transition, not because they happen exactly on the birthdays, but they notice that there's an incredible amount of activity in a couple years before and after those ages. They came to believe that it seems like every 10 years we either consciously or unconsciously do a life review and ask those questions. Am I happy? What am I doing here? Why am I doing it? Does it make a difference? Have I made good decisions? It's times when we can experience depression or anxiety or other symptoms. It's times when people engage in problem behaviors, substance use, affairs, divorce. So there are times when there's lots and lots of danger. But there are also the times when we make the best decisions in our lives, where we decide to change course, go back to school, get married, have children, do something that we love, discern God's call for our life. There can be times when we respond to the danger and experience all kinds of upheaval, make poor decisions. Or there can be times when we make the best decisions of our lives, change course, heal relationships, discover the purpose for which we were created. Decisions that make all the difference for our lives. Elijah gets up from underneath that tree. There's something about God's actions that get him moving. And we're told that he travels for 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain where Moses met God face to face and got the 10 Commandments. He apparently spends the night in the cave where Moses spent the night so many years before, waiting for a message from God. And we're told that incredibly powerful winds come along that disrupt the rocks and bend trees. But God's voice is not in the winds. And it's followed by a mighty earthquake and roaring fires, but God's voice isn't in the earthquake or the fires. And then it has what I find to be a really intriguing phrase. Elijah hears the sound of sheer silence. Think about that, the sound of sheer silence. And apparently here God whispers to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" As Elijah wrestles with that question, it appears that he becomes clear again on his purpose. He becomes ready once again to answer God's call to him. He leaves the mountain and re-enters his work as a prophet. He's now ready to face the danger and to seize the opportunity. I don't know when your next time will be. I don't know when you'll find yourself at a crossroads again. But I hope that you'll listen for the sound of sheer silence, that you'll hear the quiet voice of God asking you, "What are you doing here?" I hope that you'll wrestle with the question. I hope that you'll face the danger and that you'll seize the opportunity. I hope that you'll find the purpose for which you were created. I hope that you will clarify God's call for you. I encourage you, face the danger, seize the opportunity. Face the danger, seize the opportunity. It will make all the difference for our lives. Amen.